A man turns people's thinking upside down. His profession, philosopher. His name, Immanuel Kant. His motto, dare to know. That was pretty bold for back then. Kant was born 300 years ago in what was then called Königsberg. But what he thought is at least as relevant today as it was in his day.
He was not just a cerebral armchair philosopher. He was very curious about the world.
Kant was the first person to really work out a view saying we should be connected with each other.
Kant said that injustice happening in one place on the planet is felt everywhere.
And that's exactly why Kant is so important today. Immanuel Kant developed his ideas in a Europe dominated by absolutist rulers. In that atmosphere, he demanded we should think for ourselves.
That's one message that Kant is sending. Be less afraid, have some courage.
That was easier said than done. One wrong word said against those in power could have drastic consequences. Nothing in Kant's early life would suggest that he would become one of the most important thinkers in history, or that his ideas would change philosophy forever. He had humble beginnings, born to a craftsman father and a mother who never attended school. Immanuel, the fourth of 11 children, soon demonstrated how intelligent he was, which was his opportunity to get ahead.
Interestingly, social advancement through talent was always possible, but you had to be brilliant.
Kant breezed through both school and university. For a while, he paid for his education as, among other things, a successful billiards player. But he was especially interested in philosophy, metaphysics, mathematics, natural history, and astronomy, a real polymath. In his studies, Kant relied on the power of thought and reason. He firmly believed
that people can enlighten themselves together as a society.
In Kant's day, Königsberg was part of the Kingdom of Prussia, with Berlin as the capital. Today, it's called Kaliningrad and is in the Russian Federation. Kant rarely left his hometown, but as a Baltic trading port, it was well connected with the wide world beyond. Kant's meteoric rise to intellectual stardom began late. At the age of 57, he published his magnum opus, The Critique of Pure Reason. It was followed by one bestseller after another, making him quite rich and allowing him to move in the highest circles of society. Probably no other philosopher has shaped modern thought as much as he has. Standing only 1.57 meters tall, this little man from Königsberg is an intellectual giant to many philosophers today.
I'll be a Kantian to the rest of my life.
Incidentally, some of his contemporaries thought Kant was kind of quirky. He was someone who woke every morning at 4:45, drank 2 cups of tea, and smoked a pipe, taught from 7 to 9, and thought from 9 to 1:45. Then he wrote and went for a walk in the afternoon, all at precisely the same time every day. During Kant's lifetime, people were surrounded by authorities: the king, the military, the church. Most people did what they were told, partially out of fear.
People were threatened with execution. People were threatened with exile. People were thrown into prison. I mean, this happened all over France, in many places in Germany, in many places in England. There were just many things that were a lot worse than a Twitter storm.
So then Kant came along in this authoritarian world and turned human thinking on its head. What he demanded is actually simple, but courageous and productive. He said people should use their own minds instead of following instructions. Sapere, aude, dare to know.
Thinking for ourselves is also supposed to get us out of certain comfort zones, where we're not allowed to make things easier for ourselves. And many things require us to be discriminating, self-critical, and humble.
But according to Kant, thinking for oneself also means debate, discussion, and confrontation with other opinions.
Taking a closer look at what it actually means to think for ourselves, it means examining along with others whether what we think is right is also tenable, and that is what he means.
Kant says,
Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity.
Immaturity, sure, but why self-imposed?
It's partly our own fault, but the cowardice is certainly furthered by the ruling powers, also the church, of course. And he says the so-called guardians treat the people like housefee, dumb animals, okay? And dumb animals are tame, and they're much easier to control. And that's, of course, a really radical message.
Kant observed the starry sky and made a fascinating discovery. No, not a new planet. Not even extraterrestrials, who he firmly believes exist. Looking into the infinite, into what he called the starry heavens, Kant sensed a second infinity, one within himself, something that distinguishes him, the human being, from the animals, his moral law. He puts this into a formula that most people may have heard of, the famous Categorical Imperative.
Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
Another revolutionary demand. Sure, the concept of considering what our actions mean for other people is not entirely new. What is new is that Kant manages without a higher moral authority, and therefore without God.
He wants people to recognize what is right and what is wrong on the basis of reason. They should question themselves and not just rely on divine authorities.
And since then, nothing's been the same. A whole system of thought now rests on human reason. That's a huge responsibility.
Kant gives three formulations of the categorical imperative. And I think the most important one is to act as if everyone is an end in themselves. And that just means never use anybody as a means, never instrumentalize people, okay? Which is actually much harder to follow than it sounds.
Kant's affirmation of human dignity was a very political spin on philosophy. The world Kant lived in was deeply shaken in 1789 by the French Revolution. In Paris, some 1,700 kilometers away from Königsberg, the Bastille was stormed and heads rolled, literally, in a quest for liberty and a better life. What did Kant make of it all?
Kant shares ideals that fueled the French Revolution, the idea of equality, of equal freedoms, the idea of republicanism, that people should also be politically mature and capable of governing themselves.
Even though Kant rejected uprisings and revolts, he now bluntly criticized the privileges of the nobility, the paternalism of the church, and colonialism. A fairer world seemed possible, and Kant wanted his philosophy to have a practical effect, leading to a better life and freedom. The political consequences can still be observed today.
I actually think that Kant's philosophy is the only basis for a living liberal left. The values that we desperately need today were all there in Kant.
I believe this is an incredibly demanding legacy, which, if we are honest, maybe also shames us, because in many ways we do not live up to this standard.
That's especially the case in regard to global justice.
When it comes to the relations between the global north and the global south, there's a lot of injustices. Especially policies that come from international financial institutions that have introduced neoliberalism in Africa. And the neoliberalism in a number of countries has led to greed, land grabbing, corruption, and so on. So this is an injustice. Kant would argue that this is a violation of his categorical imperative.
Very few people demonstrating for peace today are likely to know they owe a debt to Kant, who was passionate about preventing war. He was over 70 when he formulated his thoughts on the subject in his essay, Perpetual Peace. The ideas in it were radically modern for 1795, a time when war was the order of the day.
He bets on treaties between sovereign states. It was very progressive for the time. Today we have to recognize that bilateral treaties are not enough, especially if a side like Russia cancels its own treaties overnight. Rather, we need international controls, which is what Kant also wanted.
Kant experienced 3 wars in his lifetime and the Russian occupation of Königsberg. He knew what war meant.
What is most radical about his writing are the demands that he derives from this ideal of world peace. And from today's point of view, these demands are just as unfulfilled as they were back then, that states trust each other to such an extent that they no longer maintain standing armies considered a threat to others. So these are still utopian ideas today.
Wars have certainly taken place in the years since Kant's death. Yet his ideas sound almost like the how-to guide for establishing the United Nations, 150 years after his peace proposal. A serious and at least partially successful attempt to ensure peace in the world. Kant may have lived in the age of Enlightenment, but, as he recognized, it was not an enlightened age. And he himself was not an enlightened person either. As modern as many of his ideas seem to us now, he was blatantly wrong on other points.
Humanity has its highest degree of perfection in the white race.
Especially disturbing is that in his theory of the alleged human races, Kant linked external characteristics with intellectual and moral qualities.
For him, the Amerindians, which represent the so-called red race, are incapable of culture. That means they basically cannot even leave the state of nature. And then the black race are capable of only culture of slavery. Namely, they cannot, advance to more advanced culture. And the so-called yellow race, represented by East Indians and Chinese, among others, cannot engage in more advanced culture. Kant thinks that only Western Europeans can have all the talents and drives to keep going and realizing humanity with respect to its moral destiny.
Today, that way of thinking is completely unacceptable. And it would seem to totally contradict Kant's idea of universalism, the idea that human dignity is derived from our ability to reason. Do his racist statements erase Kant's philosophy and his thinking on justice?
When you look at his theory, the consistency of his theory, according to many Kantian scholars, so these are the ideas about two races, are quite peripheral when you look at this, the core of his philosophy. So we assess him basing on the core and consistency of his epistemology, ethics, and metaphysics.
In fact, in his later work, Kant advocated equal rights for all people. So did he recant his earlier racist statements? That's hotly debated among Kant scholars. It is clear that Kant's opinions in this matter were firmly rooted in the thinking of his time. That also applies to his anti-Semitism and his disregard for women. Still, as an old man, Kant made a radical demand, calling for a right of world citizenship, a global right of visitation for all people. Above all, refugees should not be turned away.
At that time, Kant saw something that unfortunately was no longer accepted as a matter of course in the 20th century, namely that every citizen must be allowed to leave their country and seek shelter somewhere else if they are accepted. It would be great if the world would remember that these are things that are actually self-evident.
As utopian as Kant's ideas of perpetual peace, global citizenship, and justice sound, he was certainly not a dreamer. On the contrary, he looked very soberly at reality, but he did believe in hope.
So the question is how Kant understood hope. He didn't understand it as a feeling or an emotion. He understood it as a moral obligation.
A postulate of practical reason in that if we want to survive and keep going, we need hope, even if sometimes there is nothing to support it.
I mean, the worst will happen if we give up hope. Hope is precisely something that you need when you're feeling close to despair.
Let's summarize it like this. As long as we don't know that everything is meaningless, like our efforts for justice and peace, we must keep trying, according to Kant. Now that sounds like a pretty good idea. What do you think? Do Kant's ideas have any relevance to you? Let us know in the comments.